This is a TalkStation original podcast.
This article comes from restorativefaith.org, and it is getting actually a lot of traction among a lot of pastors and church people through Facebook and other organizational sharings and things like that. So it is from Pastor Alexander Lang who wrote this, and this is the title entitled Departure: Why I Left the Church. And he writes, "This past Sunday, I preached my last sermon as the pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Arlington Heights. I made the decision that I'm not only leaving my post as head of staff, but I'm also going to be leaving the pastorate altogether. I no longer have a desire to serve as a pastor in the church. In my sermon, I told my congregation that I was exhausted from writing, memorizing, and preaching sermons week after week for 10 years, which is true. However, there are other reasons why I'm leaving that I didn't have time to discuss in my sermon, and I want to utilize this article to do a deep dive into how I came to my decision: the Great Pastor Resignation. I've become part of what is known as the Great Pastor Resignation that came in the wake of the pandemic. Barna did a national survey of pastors, and as of March 2022, 42% of pastors considered quitting. The reasons for this are myriad, but the top 5 reasons given are as follows. Number 1, 56% of pastors said the immense stress of the job. Number 2, 43% said, I feel lonely and isolated. Number 3, 38% said current political divisions. Number 4, 29% said, I am unhappy with the effect this role has on my family. And number 5, 29% said, I'm not optimistic about the future of my church. The author goes on to say, I can relate to all of these, but in particular, the top 2 were the ones that figured heavily into my decision. Being a pastor is like being a parent. You can imagine what it's like to have a child, but until you are in the role, you cannot fully appreciate what it is like to shoulder the responsibility of caring for a life 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The same is true for being a pastor. You think you know what to expect, but the lived experience is very different from your imaginings of what it will be. If I was to articulate my perspective on the contrast between the two, what you don't realize is how enmeshed you will become in other people's lives. As a pastor, you are there for all of the peaks and the valleys. You are there to celebrate the weddings and the births. You are also there for the sicknesses, tragedies, and deaths. I don't know anyone who has become a pastor not knowing this is what you are signing up for. However, the reality is what this does to you mentally and emotionally, that it's taxing over the long haul. The article goes on to identify that there are about 7 different things of which for this pastor and for each of us pastor, that there's all types of things that we have to face, from having all kinds of different bosses, the number of parishioners that we have in our church, to all kinds of unrealistic expectations. But ultimately, the author of the article kind of puts together that for the pastor, there are mainly 7 different professions, if you will, that we as pastors must fulfill, each one the same. That we have to be professional speakers, that we have to be CEOs, runners of the church, that we must be counselors, fundraising, raising money not just to pay for our salaries, but also to pay for the bills, to keep the lights on, the bulletins printed and whatnot. That we have to be human resource directors, being able to keep staff running efficiently and things like that. Masters of ceremonies when it comes to weddings, to funerals and the like. And that also that we must be the pillars of virtue. That everything we do is under the magnifying glass. Our lives are constantly in the fishbowl, whether it be for us or for our family, for our children, for our spouses. And all of this begins to take a toll. And the article continues to go on. And So, Carl, you have not been in the pastorate as long as I have, but what do you think as you've read through some of these musings of this author?
Well, I have been a pastor now for close to 20 years. One of the first things I thought when I read this was, wow, I can relate to just about everything that he is saying. And I have some colleagues who did, in fact, walk away from the ministry. And this happened during COVID, where they were trying to do what was best for the people in their church. And there were people in their church who were unhappy about the fact that they were not meeting in person, that they were enforcing safety and health precautions within the church. And one friend of mine, he and I have been in the ministry together for years, he called me one evening after a staff parish meeting, and he said, I quit after tonight's meeting. I quit at the meeting. And I said, you mean you're going to go to another church? He said, no. He said, I'm done. I'm walking away from the ministry. And it was a very painful decision for him. He was the son of a pastor. He had worked very hard as a pastor. He was an excellent pastor. But it just got to where he said, I can't fight the battles anymore. And he also saw the toll that it was taking on his family. You know, the writer says, until you've been a parent, you don't understand what it is to be a parent. Until you have been a pastor, you don't understand the toll that being a pastor can take on a family, because it does. You're getting ready to go somewhere with your family, the phone rings. Guess what? Jim has to bow out and go to the hospital or whatever. And listeners, I hope that you don't think that Jim and I are sitting here going, this is just so unfair. We don't like this. No, I do this because I love to do this. And when I get that emergency phone call and I have to leave and I can be there for someone in a crisis moment and bring the presence of God into the room. I mean, God's already present, but maybe the people need something tangible there, somebody to hold on to, somebody to pray with them. I am so privileged to be able to be in that space, but it takes a toll.
Absolutely. You know, and I think one of the things, they don't teach us this at the seminary. They teach us to be very black and white when it comes to theology. And yet the parish is 1,000 shades of gray. And trying to understand what it's like to be at the bedside of someone before they breathe their final breath. What it's like to do weddings and see the joyfulness and the happiness. What it's like to run your first church council meeting as a sole pastor and you're going through the budget and you're like, what have I gotten into? You know, there's just those kind of things that are just crazy. Sometimes I tell people, you know, not just on the local level, but throughout our national church bodies, is sometimes church politics can be very, very ugly. And sometimes secular politics has nothing on church politics. And I love what the article said, where the pastor who wrote the article says, in my previous congregation, a member who was a former state senator for the Pennsylvania legislature refused to volunteer for our boards because he felt that the church boards were too cutthroat. I found that to be incredible that this man worked at the highest level of state government and he felt politics were less toxic than volunteering for a leadership role on the board for his local church. And how often have we seen that? You know, that we have seen boards that are just kind of mean. And then the pastor says also in the article, I've been the target of mudslinging. Some members of my community were so opposed to my leadership that they took steps to create a movement to have me removed from my post. At first, it was an underground movement to convince the governing board of the church that a majority of my parishioners were discontent with my leadership. When that was unsuccessful, they went public by sending out an email to the entire congregation to build enough momentum to have me forcibly removed. And I think, again, you know, it just kind of shows when sinners are in charge of a divine institution, we will always find a way to muck it up.
Yes. Yes, we will. And it's so important to remember that the church is this divinely established institution, as you said, and we are brought together by God, but the people that God brings together are broken and imperfect people, and like you said, we can really mess things up. Now, at my last church, before I moved to Morehead City, there was a group that decided that it was time for me to leave. And it was not the majority of the church. It was just a handful of people. But one morning, I arrived at the church to find 3 men waiting for me. And I got there, and they took me in a room and sat me down and closed the door and said, "It's time for you to leave our church." It was one of the most painful days I've ever had in the ministry, to think, I'm looking at them and thinking, I held your hand while your wife was having open heart surgery. I did the funeral for your mother. I married your child, whatever. I have been there for you, and now you're just kicking me out. And it was hard. But as Jim mentioned, there's a lot to unpack in this article, so we'll be back after these messages to take it a little bit further.
Hi, I'm JJ Smith.
And I'm Zach Nally.
And we're Carteret County News-Times reporters and hosts of the new podcast, Paper Boys.
Join us each week as we bring you exclusives with coaches and athletes, tournament organizers, and newsmakers in the world of sports.
We'll cover high school football, basketball, and so much more, as well as catch up with former star athletes from our county and beyond.
Listen every week to the Paper Boys podcast, streaming now on Spotify, YouTube, and at CarolinaCoastOnline.com. New episodes every Friday.
Welcome back to Faith Matters here on the Talk Station. This is Carl Zarowski. I'm here with Jim Dalbin. We have been looking at an article, a very poignant article written by a pastor who has made the decision to walk away from pastoral ministry, or from pastoral ministry within the organizational church. I do want folks to know that as I read the article anyway, I didn't see that he was leaving with bitterness, but instead he felt like there was something else God wanted him to do with his calling, and it wasn't leading the institutional church. One of the problems that happens with ministry is that the church is made of people, and people are broken. We're sinners. God has created this wonderful divine institution, and he's made it out of imperfect people. And one of the issues that pastors run into is that we cannot make everybody in the church happy. I had a district superintendent one time who said, "Oh, but you can make everybody in the church happy." And I said, "How?" He said, "Well, some are happy when you come, some are happy while you're there, and some are happy when you leave."
Amen.
People have an expectation of what church should be. One of the things that the writer of the article says, he says, most Christians don't want their thinking challenged. And I thought this was one of the most powerful paragraphs in the entire article. Most Christians don't want their thinking challenged. They come to church to reinforce what they've believed their entire lives. From their perspective, the job of the pastor is not to push them to grow, but to reassure them that they are already on the right track. Any learning should support the party line and comfort them that their investment of resources in the church will result in a payoff somewhere down the line, particularly once they reach the afterlife. And what he talks about here, he's talking about two types of mindsets among people. One is a fixed mindset, and the other is a growth mindset. He said that his most recent therapist introduced him to the concept of growth mindset versus fixed. A growth mindset is when a person is willing to take chances, enjoys learning new things, and is not afraid to fail. Conversely, people with fixed mindsets don't like to be challenged. They perceive failure as the limit of their abilities. They tend to be scared of learning new things, particularly if that education disrupts their current view. So, have you ever heard, I shouldn't even ask this. I know the answer to this. Have you ever had someone in your church say, we've never done it that way.
We're Lutheran. We say it all the time.
Well, we say it that way in the United Methodist Church as well.
We think that's Jesus' 7 last words from the cross. We've never done it that way before. And I think that's the challenge. And I think sometimes that's the challenge, at least for me as a pastor, is sometimes I feel like the gerbil on the wheel, that you're just doing the same thing week after week, over and over, over and over. And I get the sense that for this pastor, that was his greatest challenge. But as you do the same thing over and over, then you have, at least in his congregation, he had 1,000 members, you have 1,000 bosses who are telling him how to do the same thing over and over 1,000 different ways. Mm-hmm. And then of that 1,000, he had 300 who attended on a regular basis. And at least for us in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, you have the divine third. If you have a third of the people on your rolls in your pews, you're doing really well. So his 300 people telling him how to do the same thing over and over, don't tell us different. Don't tell us to try new things. Don't tell us to do it. Only added to that burden on his conscience and on his soul, and sapping the joy of the ministry from him. Mm-hmm. And I think there is those sometimes that struggle that is there, and I wonder sometimes how much of that sapping of joy is also for the people in the pews. I know we sometimes see people who work on different boards and committees and volunteer around the church, and then all of a sudden they just stop because someone who doesn't help out often is super critical about something that they're doing. And yet you say, well, how about you help out? No, I don't want to do that. And, and again, I know that sinful nature and original sin, and we're all, sinful and things. You even look at the disciples, they constantly bickered amongst themselves. Who was the greatest? Which one did Jesus love more? And shoot, you're with the Son of God and things. But you look at is what is ultimately for the church. The church's job, if you will, to go make disciples, to teach other people, to love as Christ has loved, to care as Christ has cared. And I think sometimes in the church we get so wrapped up on whether or not the color of the carpeting is right, or if the fold in the bulletin was just straight enough.
I know, and that's just so trivial. But let me ask you this: what keeps you as a pastor, or makes you a little bit cautious when you have to challenge your church's way of thinking? Let's say that you're putting a sermon together, and God speaks to you really loud and really hard about something that needs to change in the way your church does things. What is it that makes you a little cautious to speak on that?
I think what makes me a bit cautious is how will not just the people react, but how will some overreact? Mm-hmm. And I think that for all of us pastors, is how is some of the things. My members have gotten kind of the joke of I'll always ask the question with things like when I first came, I always asked, help me understand how this came about or how this is, because they always say when you come to a new pastorate, never make major changes within the first year. Mm-hmm. About 6 months I was starting to make changes, but I never told the people I was making changes, right? But help me understand, so in there, or if I need something that I see is that we really need to be doing, I'll say, well, how easy would it be for us to start doing this? And so now that's the joke. If I say, well, how easy would it be? They're like, oh, what do you want done?
Yeah.
And so it's
what is it this time?
What is it this time?
Yeah.
But I think that's the great joy is if you have people who see the mission of the church and the mission of reaching out invested in the church, it makes things a whole lot different. But I think sometimes we have the challenge within our churches, and for us as pastors, how do you change the mindset that if you see the paraments that have IHS embroidered on it, which is the first 3 letters in Greek for Jesus, it doesn't mean 1 hour service. Church is more than just 60 minutes. It's gathering together. It's fellowship.
But what happens is people get into this routine.
Yeah.
Okay. When I was at Duke, we always used to be told, this is not your father's church. This is not 1950s church in America anymore.
Yeah.
And sadly, a lot of church is still 1950s church. People don't like that challenge. They don't like to see that changed.
Yeah.
Most Christians don't want their thinking challenged. They don't want their church changed. Jesus challenged the church's thinking. When you
Absolutely.
talk about the church being the established Jewish religious structure, Jesus came in and changed a whole lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And they didn't like that. In the same way, Jesus challenges the church's thinking today. In the Methodist Church, we talk about grace a lot. And one of the types of grace we talk about is sanctifying grace. That is, once you come to know Jesus, once you understand that your sins are forgiven, and once you enter into this relationship with God through Christ, God's not done with you. He continues to sanctify you or transform you, which means change you, which means changing the way you think, changing the way you act as you become more and more like Christ.
Yeah.
And that involves change.
Exactly. And I think to remind all the listeners, pastors are human. Pastors, we are sinners just like you. We have the joy of proclaiming the good news. We have the joy of being with you as you walk through your valley, but as you stand on the top of the mountain. And we have the joy of being there in those moments. And October is Pastor Appreciation Month, and we're not just like looking for gifts. We'll give you our address if you'd like to send us gifts. No, I'm just kidding. But we're looking.
Just send them to the radio station in care of Ross. He'll get them to us.
Exactly. But it's the little things that bring pastors joy, like getting a text message of word of encouragement or a little card or things like that. But it's what we should be doing, not just for the pastor to people to pastor, but the church together.
Right.
And the pastor wrote this poem at the very end. And do you mind if I share that?
So please do.
And he writes, "And though we may stumble, and though we may fall, we shall tarry amidst the tides, seeking the better angles of our nature. And as we bid farewell to our friends who journey before us, our hearts eternally whisper, aching for the timbre of their voice. And when our lives are but memories long lost like the breath of wind, we shall find each other once again, consoled by the tears of our long embrace. And beauty through piercing will not leave us undone, for our love will bind us together, and we shall always know that we are truly one."
I'm Ryan Kelly,
I'm Lynn Schultz.
and we're the hosts of the Senior Moment Podcast.
Each week we bring you conversations with experts right here in our community about the common and uncommon challenges facing our aging population and caregivers.
We discuss the challenges of caring for a loved one with dementia, as well as the importance of health planning, family history, and much more.
Join us every week for Senior Moment, streaming now on Spotify, YouTube, and at CarolinaCoastOnline.com.